Good evening, folks, and welcome to the first ever edition to the Law Lounge, where, as just like a substitute teacher, I'm going to teach you all about things I have no business talking about. Seeing this is the first time for both of us, and we're probably both really nervous, I'll put some sultry music on and kind of explain what the plan is, okay? The Law Lounge is our little deep dive into the background, mythology and history of your favourite games, your favourite films, comic books, even TV series. And we're going to kind of have a look at all the things that make those fandoms feel really, truly like living, breathing universes. Our first mini-series is going to be focused on a game called Dungeons & Dragons. You might be aware of it, you might not. You might be aware of it for all the wrong reasons. You might have seen it in Stranger Things, you might know about Critical Role. But it is huge in terms of lore. And there is just so much to potentially talk about. So I thought we could put a little mini-series together to discuss all the things that make up the world of Dungeons & Dragons. As a little caveat, Dungeons & Dragons has been around for many years across multiple editions, which means that a lot of things, well, I say the opposite of a lot of things, very few things are considered canon. Now in this instance, in this entire mini-series, I'm going to try to stick to things that are canon as of 5th edition, so that we're as close to definitive as we can be for now, and then when 6th edition comes around and flips everything on its head, maybe we'll do another series. While Beyond the Witchlight is going to be a new adventure module released by Wizards of the Coast, and it's going to be the first adventure ever in 5th edition that's going to be set in the Feywild. You may be familiar with it, you may be not, but in any case, it does beg the question, what the fuck is the Feywild? Now, in order to be able to understand the Feywild, you need a little bit of background knowledge on how the world and the cosmos of Dungeons & Dragons works. So, without giving you too much information, mostly because I think I could probably squeeze another video out of it, I will just give you a sort of brief overview of how, as of this edition, the cosmos is kind of set out. So there's this giant wheel, and right in the middle is the prime material plane, the bit that connects all the spokes to the outside of the wheel. And outside of that are multiple other planes, the ethereal plane, the astral plane, all sorts of other shit all around the bit in the middle. Prime material plane, obviously, as you can imagine, is the real world for all intents and purposes. The Feywild, alongside the Shadowfell, exists as sort of echoes of the prime material plane. The reason they exist, not necessarily as separate planes in themselves, is way back when, long time ago, minimum of 6 months ago, the Primordials, who are, I guess, the equivalent of like the Titans from Greek mythology, who are, you know, equal to or potentially even stronger in power than like gods and deities and stuff. The Primordials are a group of beings that lived alongside the gods during the kind of first era of the universe, the cosmos of Dungeons and Dragons. They were equal to, potentially even more powerful than the gods at the time. Debatable, of course. I won't go into too much detail because, again, it could be another video, and I gotta squeeze as much content out as I can. But essentially, they took a look at the prime material plane. They looked down and they thought, "Whoa, man, that's just way too bright for me." On one side, didn't like how bright part of it was, and then his buddy was like, "Whoa, I also think this part's a little too dark," and they thought part of it was too dark too. And as a group, collectively, they thought, you know what? I'm not dealing with all this darkness and all this brightness, and I'm not made of money to have to deal with it. The electricity bills to light all that, and the potentially further electricity bills you'd have to use to light up the dark bits, it's just not worth it. So they thought, and they essentially tore the prime material plane into three. So you have the middle bit, that's the kind of balanced, not too ethereally bright and not too shadowy and dark part where we would exist if we were to live in the game. And then the dark area as a new echo of the prime material plane exists as the Shadowfell, which I'm sure we'll talk about another time. And the other side is the Feywild. Both the Feywild and the Shadowfell geographically sort of mirror the prime material plane. So for the most part, if there's a mountain here and I'll use here as a term to just describe the prime material. There's going to be a mountain in the Feywild, and there's going to be a mountain in the Shadowfell too. That doesn't necessarily mean it's going to look identical and it's going to be in the exact same spot, but it does mirror the prime material very, very closely. And you can, to some extent, kind of use the geography of the prime material then to make your way around both of those places, although it isn't quite that simple, and the geography moves and shifts depending on what happens elsewhere. To briefly explain how both of those realms kind of differ from the prime material and differ from each other, imagine Bratz dolls. In one side you've got like in the Feywild you've got Bratz with like fairy wings, unicorn Bratz, other Bratz like pixie Bratz, and then in the Shadowfell you got that one that I saw in Home Bargains where there's like one's Dracula, like Frankenbrat and Count Bratula. They're in the Shadowfell. Okay, so just think of Bratz whenever you're trying to understand this, and you shouldn't go wrong. I know too much about Bratz dolls, clearly. To shamelessly quote the Dungeon Master's Guide, I will read verbatim how the Feywild is described, and I think it does a good job of kind of outlining what the Feywild is. The Feywild, also called the Plain of Faerie, is a land of soft light and wonder, a place of music and death. It is a realm of everlasting twilight with glittering fairy lights bobbing in the gentle breeze and fat fireflies buzzing through groves and fields. The sky is alight with faded colours of an ever-setting sun which never truly sets, or rises for that matter. It remains stationary, dusky and low in the sky, away from the settled areas ruled by the Seelie Fae that compose the Summer Court. The land is a tangle of sharp-toothed brambles and syrupy fens, perfect territory for the unseelie Fae to hunt their prey. In a bit, we'll talk a little bit about the inhabitants of the Feywild, which were touched upon in that little excerpt there. But for now, you're probably thinking, Nat, to be honest, you're selling the Feywild to me. I might bin off the holiday to Lanzarote. I'll contact EasyJet, cancel the flight. I'll bin that off, and I might go to the Feywild instead. To which I would say, obviously you've not been listening to what I've been saying, because it's a game and it's made up, okay? So pay attention, please, because there's a lot to take in. And if you think you can go on holiday to this place, you're stupid, okay? Because you weren't listening to the beginning bit, because it's not real. But if the Feywild was to pop up a couple of boutique hotels or some cabins with a hot tub on Airbnb, there's probably a couple of reasons you probably still wouldn't want to go there. The biggest, at least one of the reasons I would say the Feywild might not be a good holiday destination is, just as it mentioned, the sun and the movement of the sun doesn't really work. It just kind of stays there in the sky. It's kind of how time works as well. So whenever you enter the Feywild, time becomes dilated, and not necessarily lengthen time either. So you could potentially step into the Feywild, be there for a couple of minutes, and step back out, and it could be years later. On the flip side, you could be there for years, and then return back to the prime material, and it's only been like a couple of minutes. So you've built all these like crazy strong relationships or whatever with people, or gone through these trials and tribulations, and you come out and people are like, "What are you doing?" "I've just been for a dump." And you're covered in scars or something. You know what I mean? You've grown a beard. What's going on? Another reason that the Feywild might not be a great holiday destination, you might want to stick to, going to Salou and what's it called, Fortaventura and all those kinds of gaffs, is the Feywild is a place of pure primal magic. And if you know anything about magic, which you shouldn't because magic isn't real, but if you know how magic works in games and stuff, you know for the most part, magic is something that very much needs to be controlled, whether it's through a sorcerer, a wizard, warlocks and other beasties and whatever. It isn't something you just want sort of flipping around all over the place. Now, imagine magic like a gun. Guns are pretty dangerous at the best. I say very dangerous at the best times, because they can kill you. In the hands of a gunman, maybe not a gunman, maybe a trained professional gun handler with a gun. If he's roaming about with a gun, it's at least a 6 on the danger scale, okay? Now imagine you're walking through this beautiful, glowing, effervescent field, and instead of a bunch of guys with guns, these guns are just flying around everywhere, and they're just bullets flying all over the shop. Dangerous. Way more than a 6 out of 10. Minimum 7. Potentially an 8. Probably. This is a little bit of an oversimplification of how magic works in the Feywild, but it does kind of still solidify my point in that magic becomes very dangerous when it's uncontrolled. This uncontrolled magic flows through the fauna and the flora of the Feywild, and as a result, those things become very dangerous too because of their innate magical abilities. You could be sauntering through this, wonderful, beautiful spring, going for a swim, jumping out and be poisoned by a bunch of mushrooms, or attacked by a displacer beast that can teleport across the trees. You know what I mean? Not ideal for a holiday. And there's no beaches, as far as I'm aware. Let's say you weren't too bothered by the effects of magic flying around everywhere, and the thought of flying guns shooting bullets all over the place doesn't scare you. And say you weren't too worried about the sort of lasting psychological effects the time dilation might have on your body and mind. I suppose it kind of begs another question, is how do you get there? Now, the simplest and most common way to reach the Feywild, and it's a kind of similar way to get to the Shadowfell as well, but the most common way is using Fey crossings. Now, the Feywild is very much fairy tale like, and as a result, you may kind of be able to use fairy tales and the way things like that work as a kind of understanding of how Fey crossings work as well. So you might have heard stories of like changelings, for example. They're of like snatched children or swapped with children, etc., depending on the changeling myth, and kind of run through the middle of a bunch of holly sprigs and vanished into thin air, or dived into the hollow of a tree, for example. You dip your head in, changeling, and there's no one there, or at least they don't say anything back to you, they could be hiding. That's kind of how Fey crossings work. They're little mirrored sort of sections of the world that, as far as you're aware, are just kind of it's just the real world. But you could just kind of mosey on down the path, and as far as you're aware, poof, you're in the Feywild with no idea where the crossing may have been, depending on how long you blink. If you're walking and you blink, like that's how long it takes you to blink, it's going to be quite some path before you know where the exact bit of the crossing was. And then if you blinked, turn, you got no chance of getting home. Now, for the person who sees you disappear, as far as they're aware, you just vanished. But to you, it's kind of you just walked into the Feywild. There are more sort of static Fey crossings set in the world, but of course they're going to be protected by magic, by soldiers, or whatever it might be. Other ones that kind of naturally occur in Fey crossings are kind of like super hipster, you know what I mean? Like you have to meet certain criteria to be able to do it. There has to be a full moon. You had to have had quinoa for dinner, You have to think jackfruit is even closely related in terms of taste and texture to pulled pork. You have to meet really stupid criteria. So if you're a vegan, you probably can go to the Feywild pretty easily. Now let's get to the meat of what truly makes up the Feywild and what truly makes up the world. The people that live there. And this time, I guess, not necessarily just people. Now, the Feywild, again, just like the real world, is made up of a bunch of factions. We may call them countries here, but for the most part, it's just a bunch of tribes in it who have, for one reason or another, kind of dislike each other. That's the world. There are two main, and I, quote unquote, say factions because it isn't quite that simple, but there are two sort of large entities, I guess, of people and creatures that make up the Feywild. The first one is the Seelie Fey, also known as the Summer Court. Those names can be used sort of interchangeably. The Summer Court is made up of kind of the sylvan fairy tale creatures that you could probably imagine you would find somewhere like this. You know, pixies, centaurs, satyrs, and fairies, I guess, as you would know them. And they're typically sort of associated with vibrant life, energy, strength, warmth, the sun, hence the name Summer Court. And this typically kind of gives off the assumption that those who are associated with the Summer Court are the good guys. And just like real life, it isn't quite that black and white. And I would say for the most part, this is due to, in real life, you know, sun, vibrancy, painting, art, parties are all good stuff, you know. And you assume, well, people like that, they must be good. But it, like I said, it's not quite that simple. I would say the best way to describe this would be not necessarily that these creatures are innately good, but they're more capable of doing good. So, you know, if you were to come across these creatures, you may feel a little bit more comfortable and safe, but that doesn't mean they're not going to just flip out and chop your head off, you know what I mean? I think what needs to be considered, and it's something you should consider as well, is the connotations of the sun and summer and warmth and daylight. Yeah, I said warmth instead of warmth. What you can do? The connotations that they have as being sort of good. You need to consider the bad things that come with those, and it helps you kind of understand that not everything associated with these symbolic images and themes necessarily means they're good. Summer comes with sunburn, hay fever. I suffer with both, and it fucking sucks. The Unseelie Fae, or the Glooming Court, are often associated, or at least assumed to be, the polar opposite of the Seelie Court. Now, admittedly, a lot of the creatures and beasties that are sort of involved in this are kind of bloodthirsty monsters, displacer beasts, darklings, banshees, that kind of thing. So it kind of puts them on the wrong foot. But just like I said previously, the associations that the Glooming Court have, or the symbolism even, is part of the reason they kind of get this bad rap. So they're kind of associated with darkness, with cold, with stoicism, things that are kind of, you know, like the too cool for school, smoking instead of going to PE kind of kids, you know what I mean? But that doesn't make them bad people, you know? And that doesn't make displacer beasts bad. It just means that the alignment and the association they have tends to kind of have dark and evil, you know, associations. It is probably important to know that the creatures, you know, that do make up the Glooming Court are monsters for the most part. But just like I said, it doesn't necessarily mean they're always evil. But I mean, they're kind of evil. There are two other factions that aren't native to the Feywild, and they do make up a lot of what kind of gives the Feywild a bit of an allure, and one of them being a playable race as well, so it kind of helps. I mean, two of them technically could be playable races, but an official playable race. The first of which is the Eladrin. You may have heard this name before. I think it's being used in the real world to kind of describe elven creatures. The Eladrin are elves. All elves originally came from a place called Alvendor. Part of them, or groups of them, moved to Faerun, which is part of the prime material plane, and others were drawn to this raw primal magic of the Feywild, mostly because Alvendor itself is a place very similar to that. It's got, you know, this just kind of energetic weave of magic, and I don't want to use the term weave because that's the name of magic in Dungeons and Dragons, but it is this kind of web, except instead of being kind of tied to the wall, it's, you know, when the web comes down and it blows in your face when you walk past all the trees, it is a little bit more like that, just like the Feywild. So these elves that moved to the prime material plane, to Faerun, took on more human qualities and became the elves you would regularly know. You know, they still do magic, but they're not kind of fiery and emotional. or these kind of angelic beings. They just have the pointy ears and have like innate, casting abilities. The Eladrin look and act much more like the elves that you would have found in Elvendor to begin with. They're true elves, I guess. The Eladrin, now that they're in the Feywild, are long-lived, and they're fueled by this innate magical ability that they would have kept when they've moved from Elvendor. Instead of getting involved with the courts of the Feywild, the Eladrin decided to build these huge, towering, beautiful cities with these kind of mystical libraries and beautiful towers and things, much like kind of the elven cities you'd see in Lord of the Rings. And the Eladrin, I guess, are as close to the kind of, 1,000-year-old elves and all those blokes from... I couldn't think of a single name of a character from Lord of the Rings all of a sudden, but you catch my drift. Although the Eladrin are beautiful and mystifying, their connection with the Feywild and the magic that exists in the Feywild is more chaotic. And as a result, the personalities of the Eladrin become much more chaotic as well. And the nature and the way nature entwines with magic in the Feywild often makes some of the Eladrin kind of more nature, or at least more in tune with nature, to the point that some of them are kind of seasonal. So you'll have kind of autumn Eladrin and winter Eladrin. And as a result, you have these kind of smaller groups that kind of look different. For now, I'm going to leave it there with Eladrin, mostly because I think there's so much to talk about, and there's such an interesting group, and with so much history and lore, that I think another video probably would suffice just to talk about them and how interesting they may be. You might think they're not interesting, in which another video might just make you want to unsubscribe. If you haven't, you should, and never watch us again. But in any case, I'm going to make a video about it. Similarly to myths you might have heard from Celtic countries. Which ones? Fomorians are a race of giantkin, and they were also non-native to the Feywild. They were, at the time, considered the most beautiful of the giantkin. You can imagine a giant, stunning, sculpted jaw, the lot. They were drawn to the Feywild, much like the Eladrin, around the same time, for the same reasons. They were drawn to this magic that kind of stirred within. When they did move there, they existed kind of codependently and peacefully for the most part. The problem is, this draw to this magic that existed in the Feywild twisted the hearts of these Fomorians, and as a result, they decided sharing the magic wasn't enough. They wanted to take the magic, so they decided to try to conquer and enslave the rest of the Feywild. Wonder how that went. Giants with magic, how do you think it went? It went terribly. The rest of the Fey decided to curse the Fomorians as a result of their failure and the kind of balls, really, to even try to do something like that, and twist and mutate their bodies to match the twisted and mutated hearts within. The Fomorians now live in the Feydark, which is the Feywild version of the Underdark, essentially. They live underground. They have these societies, and they do have towns and cities of sorts, but now they live in this kind of brutalitarian, if that's a word. If not, I've just made such a cool word up. The society is ruled by the most vicious and brutal and strong of the Fomorians, and if you're weak, feeble, and for the most part young, you're bottom of the food chain. And there is a constant struggle with the Fomorians and the rest of the Feywild forever now. And the Fomorians who existed in the Feywild, some of them actually moved to the Prime Material and set up in the Underdark there as well, making, the world a slightly worse place. Now, this isn't even scratching the surface of what makes up the Feywild. The Feywild existed for a long time, not necessarily in its current form, but in some form or another. And as a result, there's going to be so much more to talk about, but hopefully Wild Beyond the Witchlight is going to give us some kind of new mechanics, maybe, and a new understanding of how the Feywild exists in its current form. I'll definitely be picking it up. You should. This isn't a sponsored post, but, I mean, why not? Could be fun. If it's shit, then we can all make a video about how shit it is. You know what I mean? People love that stuff. But for now, hopefully, you can leave this video and never have to ask the question, what the fuck is the Feywild? Thanks for watching, folks. Don't forget to like and subscribe. We're very new to this. We barely know what we're doing, so we can do with all the help we could get.